What are you worried about? I'm here, the young woman said, placing a silver thermos between Julian Ashford's trembling hands. He raised his head slowly. Do you have any idea who I am? His voice was low and worn. Coming near me tonight may not be good for you. Your hands are shaking from the cold, the young woman continued, her voice carrying a patience he could not understand. Please drink some ginger tea, sir. It's freezing out here. Only then did Julian truly look at her. The girl standing before him wore a Navy maintenance uniform and worn black shoes. A plastic identification card hung from her collar. Annie Carter. Julian stared at her as though she had spoken in a language he no longer understood. You shouldn't be talking to strangers, he said. Annie glanced at the empty seats around him. You shouldn't be sitting here in wet clothes. I don't need help. Maybe not. She nodded toward the thermos. But you look cold. I'm sorry if I'm making you uncomfortable, Annie added. Your phone hasn't stopped ringing, but you haven't answered it once. And you look like someone who can't see a future anymore. Like you're running from something. He nearly told her to leave. Yet Annie did not ask for his name. She did not request a photograph. She simply sat one seat away and returned to folding a cleaning cloth in her lap. Julian looked down at the thermos. Warmth seeped through the metal into his fingers. What could you possibly know about me? He asked bitterly. No one in this world is kind enough to care about a stranger for no reason. Annie shook her head and smiled. It was a small, warm smile that revealed a row of even white teeth. I do know who you are. You're Julian Ashford. I saw you on the cover of an old issue of Vogue my grandmother keeps in a wooden trunk at home. She looked at his wet coat and shaking hands. But tonight, in this station, you're not the king of fashion. You're just a man shivering in a snowstorm. Julian stared at the thermos. The bitterness inside him rose until it pressed against his throat. Then he laughed, but there was no humor in it. The king? He said. What a joke. The man you call a king was pushed off a cliff today by the person he trusted most. My brother in everything but blood. My closest partner for 20 years. Are you talking about the man they mentioned on the news tonight? Annie sat beside him, leaving a respectful space between them. Marcus Hale. Julian spoke the name with disgust, but beneath it was something more painful. Grief. I brought him into the company when no one knew who he was. I gave him authority over every interview, every campaign, every public statement connected to Ashford Maison. I trusted him with my name. His fingers tightened around the thermos. And he sold me. Annie remained quiet. My entire haute couture collection, Julian continued. 6 years of work. Every sketch, every cut, every private note about fabric and construction. He sold all of it to Gabriel Stone, my biggest competitor. His voice began to break. And that wasn't enough. Marcus forged emails and told the world I had stolen the collection from Elliot Gray, a young designer who died 2 years ago. He used a dead man's name to bury me. Julian looked toward the departure board without seeing it. Can you believe that? They are calling me a thief. Me. His shoulders shook beneath his soaked coat. The pride of a designer who had commanded studios, runways, and boardrooms across the world began to collapse in front of a young woman carrying a cleaning cloth. I don't believe social media, Annie said. I believe what I can see with my own eyes. She hesitated before resting one hand gently against his upper back. A person who can create lines filled with that much memory and feeling could not steal another artist's soul. The words unlocked something inside him. Julian bent forward and covered his face with both hands. Hot tears slipped between his fingers, mixing with the snow that had melted along his cheeks. He cried without restraint, releasing the humiliation, anger, and betrayal he had held inside since morning. Annie did not interrupt him. She did not tell him to control himself. She stayed beside him, her hand resting lightly against his back until his breathing slowed. Her silence gave him something he had not felt all day, permission to be tired. Within a few hours, they turned me into a criminal, Julian said. The emails were fake, but the newspapers published them as fact. Brand ambassadors canceled their contracts. Department stores pulled our displays. The board demanded that I leave my own company. His voice hardened, though the tears continued. There were people outside my house calling me a thief. They said I stole the future of a dead man. I told them I was innocent, but no one wanted to listen. They had already decided I was a monster before I had the chance to defend myself. I know what strangers are saying, Annie replied. I don't know what actually happened. For the first time that day, someone had admitted that there was a difference. Julian unscrewed the thermos lid and drank. The tea was sweet, strong, and still warm. Ginger burned gently at the back of his throat, chasing away a small part of the cold. When I opened my first studio, I made a promise to my mother, he said. She was a seamstress in Brooklyn. She worked late into the night altering dresses for women who never learned her name. He stared into the steam rising from the cup. She taught me that an artist can learn from another person's hands, but must never wear their fingerprints as his own. I promised her I would never build my name on stolen work. His mouth tightened. Now millions of people believe I broke that promise. Annie did not promise that everything would be fine. She did not tell him to stay strong. She shifted slightly closer, leaving one empty seat between them. Then tonight, she said, you don't have to carry that story alone. The last wall inside him gave way. Julian Ashford, who had faced hostile investors, ruthless editors, and rooms filled with people waiting for him to fail, lowered his face into his hands and wept again. Annie remained beside him without speaking. Above them, the departure board continued changing, sending everyone else towards somewhere they belonged. For the first time that night, Julian no longer felt completely abandoned. A station announcement broke the silence above them. Several northbound trains had been suspended because of the storm, and service on the subway lines was running with long delays. Julian barely reacted. He remained bent forward, elbows on his knees. You can't stay here all night, she said. I've stayed in worse places. I doubt that. Julian lifted his head. You have no idea where I've been, and you have no idea how cold this station gets after midnight. Annie glanced toward the clock, then toward the supervisor making his final round through the waiting area. Her shift would end in 20 minutes. The reporters outside Julian's townhouse were probably still waiting for him, and every hotel in Manhattan would recognize his name before he reached the front desk. Is there someone you can call? She asked. He looked at the phone beside him. The screen showed 37 missed calls. No. You have 37 people trying to reach you. That does not mean any of them care where I sleep. Julian raised his eyes and looked around the station. The last of the evening commuters hurried beneath the high ceiling, dragging luggage toward platforms or checking the departure board for delays. Everyone appeared to have somewhere to go. His phone vibrated again. Julian pressed the power button until the screen went black. After calls from reporters demanding answers and brand ambassadors threatening to cancel their contracts, began appearing on his phone. I have nowhere to go, he whispered, his gaze unfocused. My townhouse is surrounded by reporters. The hotels. He shook his head. I don't want to see the way they'll look at me. Annie stood and placed her mop against the cleaning cart. She checked the station clock before turning back to him. My shift just ended. I live in Harlem. The apartment is small and old, but it's quiet. You can stay there tonight if you don't mind the neighborhood. A faint smile touched her face. My grandmother will be happy to have a guest. Julian stared at her. No, it's not a mansion. That is not the problem. My grandmother will be there. That does not improve the situation. It does for me. Julian looked around the station. On the opposite side of the concourse, a television displayed another photograph of Julian outside Ashford Mason. He could not hear the report, but he saw his own name beneath the word scandal. Annie followed his gaze. You can stay here and let someone recognize you, or you can have soup at my grandmother's table. Those are the choices I can offer. You bring strange men home often? No. You're the first disgraced fashion billionaire. Despite himself, Julian let out a small breath that almost became a laugh. Annie returned the thermos lid to him. That sounded better than crying. All right, he said after a moment. Thank you. I'm Annie Carter. You can call me Annie. The subway carried them away from central Manhattan toward Harlem. Julian stood beside Annie in the crowded car, one hand gripping a metal pole while melted snow dripped from his coat. He had not taken the subway in more than 15 years. Across from him, a hospital worker slept with her head against the window. An older man held 2 grocery bags between his shoes. A child rested against his father's shoulder while the train rocked through the tunnel. No one paid attention to Julian. When they left the train, sleet swept through the streetlights. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a narrow hallway that smelled of laundry detergent, radiator heat, and someone's late dinner. Annie opened the door. Warm air touched Julian's face. A radio played softly in the kitchen, carrying the final minutes of a late-night jazz program. The apartment was small but orderly. An elderly woman sat at the kitchen table, wearing a burgundy robe and reading glasses on a chain. She looked first at Annie, then at Julian. "You're late," she said. "The trains were delayed." "They always are. Who is your guest?" "Grandma, this is Julian Ashford." The woman removed her glasses. Recognition passed through her face, but she did not gasp or ask for an autograph. "I know who he is," she said. "His coat is dripping on my floor." Julian looked down. "I apologize." "Apologies don't dry hardwood. Annie, get him a towel." Annie tried not to smile. The woman rose carefully, one hand resting against the table. "Ruth Carter, Julian Ashford. I gathered that from the television. They've been saying your name every 10 minutes. Julian stiffened. Ruth noticed. "I did not say I believed them." She pointed toward a chair. "Sit down before you fall down." "I'm fine. Men who say they are fine usually need food or a doctor. I can offer one of those." Julian sat. Ruth placed a bowl of chicken soup before him, followed by a square of cornbread. She asked whether he had any food allergies, then waited until he shook his head. "In this house," she said, "we eat before we explain ourselves." Julian held the spoon but did not lift it. "I can pay you for the meal." Ruth's expression hardened. "Then you may leave." Annie stopped removing her coat. "Grandma?" "No." Ruth looked directly at Julian. "A man comes into my home cold and soaked, and I feed him because that is what decent people do. If he turns the gesture into a transaction, he insults the table." Julian lowered his eyes. "You're right. I'm sorry." Ruth sat across from him. "That apology can stay." If Ruth and Annie's kindness touched your heart, please like this video, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories. He tasted the soup. It was simple, warm, and heavier with black pepper than he expected. Something in it reminded him of the meals his mother had made when there was not enough money for anything elaborate. Annie placed his wet coat near the radiator. "Grandma puts pepper in everything." "Pepper reminds the body it's alive," Ruth said. Julian ate without speaking. Later, seated on a wooden chair beside the radiator, he studied the room around him. There were no phones ringing without pause, no camera flashes against the windows, and no television commentators repeating accusations as though repetition made them true. The quiet, unsettled Julian at first. He had lived so long among assistants, schedules, security teams, investors, and people who measured every word that silence had begun to feel like a warning. Here, it asked nothing from him. Ruth did not question him about the scandal. Annie did not ask when he planned to leave. Neither woman seemed impressed by his wealth or frightened by his fall from public favor. A strange calm settled over him. For the first time since the accusations began, Julian allowed himself to sit without preparing an answer for anyone. The old wall clock had just passed 1 when Ruth set her knitting aside. "You can sleep on the sofa," she told Julian. "It is not long enough for a man your height, but neither is the night. I should leave before morning. You can leave when the sidewalks are clear and the reporters have found someone else to torment." Julian glanced toward the window. Snow pressed against the glass in soft, uneven sheets. Somewhere below, a delivery truck struggled along the street. "I don't want to bring trouble to your door." Ruth folded her hands over the burgundy yarn in her lap. "Trouble rarely asks permission before it arrives. The best we can do is decide how to behave once it enters." Annie brought him a clean blanket and a gray sweatshirt that had belonged to her grandfather. It was too broad through the shoulders and too short at the wrists. But Julian accepted it without comment. "The bathroom is at the end of the hall," Annie said. "The hot water pipe knocks before it works. Don't let it scare you. I have survived hostile board meetings. The pipe is louder." Ruth smiled and disappeared into her bedroom. Annie turned down the radio and gathered the empty cups. Julian watched her move through the apartment with the efficiency of someone who had learned to avoid wasting time, water, or money. She washed each dish as soon as it was used, dried it, and returned it to the cabinet. Nothing was left for morning. "You work every night?" he asked. 5 nights a week, sometimes 6. "And during the day?" "I take care of Grandma, run errands, and sleep when the building is quiet enough. That cannot leave much time for anything else." Annie shrugged. "Most people don't get time. They make pieces of it." She reached beneath the kitchen table for a stack of grocery circulars. A sheet of paper slipped from between them and landed near Julian's shoe. He bent to pick it up. It was a charcoal drawing of a woman standing on a subway platform. Her coat opened behind her, in long, angled panels that echoed the converging rails. The figure's face was unfinished, but her posture conveyed impatience, fatigue, and a kind of guarded pride. Thin strokes of blue pencil suggested reflected light from an approaching train. Julian studied it longer than he intended. Annie noticed what he was holding and crossed the room quickly. "That's nothing." She reached for the page, but he turned it slightly out of reach. "Who drew this?" "I did." "You studied figure drawing?" "No." "Fashion illustration?" "No." "Perspective?" "Not officially." "That means no." "Yes." He looked at the drawing again. The anatomy was imperfect. The left hand was too narrow, and the coat could not have been constructed exactly as shown. Yet, the shape had movement. More importantly, it had a point of view. "You drew this from memory?" "I saw her waiting for the New Haven train last month. She kept checking the clock, but every time someone came near her, she pretended she wasn't waiting for anyone." Julian looked up. "How could you know that?" "I didn't. I guessed." "Why design the coat this way?" Annie hesitated, then pointed to the drawing. She looked like she wanted to leave before whoever she was waiting for arrived. "So I made the back of the coat pull away from her body, like it was already moving." Julian said nothing. Annie took the page from his hand and placed it face down on the table. "It's just something I do. No one draws like that by accident." "You're tired." "I am tired, not blind." The firmness in his voice made her step back. Julian immediately regretted the tone. He had used it for years in studios where assistants understood that criticism was part of the work. Annie had not agreed to enter that world. "I'm sorry," he said. "May I see the others?" "There aren't many." From the bedroom, Ruth called. "There are 3 boxes under her bed." Annie closed her eyes. "Grandma." "What?" He asked a direct question. Julian almost smiled. "Your grandmother appears to value honesty. She values it most when it embarrasses me." Ruth opened her bedroom door just enough to look out. Embarrassment passes. Regret has a longer lease. Then she closed the door again. Annie stood in silence for a moment before walking to the narrow room beside Ruth's. She returned carrying a battered cardboard portfolio tied with a shoelace. "You can look," she said, placing it on the table, "but don't be polite." "I have never been accused of that." She sat across from him. Inside were dozens of drawings made on whatever paper she had been able to find. The backs of discarded schedules, grocery bags cut into flat sheets, old envelopes, and pages torn from damaged notebooks. Some were portraits of travelers. Others were garments inspired by things most designers would never notice. A dress built around the circular pattern of coffee stains on a station counter. A jacket whose reflective seams followed the path of subway lines. A long evening coat shaped from the silhouette of a woman carrying 2 sleeping children. Several designs had been drawn for older women, with concealed closures and softer construction around the shoulders. One page showed a formal gown designed around a cane rather than in spite of it. Julian tapped the edge of that drawing. "Why this opening?" "So the fabric won't catch when she walks." "And the waist?" "She might need to sit for a long time." "I didn't want it pressing into her ribs." He looked at Annie. Most young designers wanted to make people appear taller, thinner, younger, or richer. Annie had drawn clothes that allowed people to remain who they were. "Where did you learn to think about the body this way?" "From Grandma. She used to sew. After her heart got worse, some of her clothes became hard to fasten." Bought things are not always made for people who move slowly." Julian turned another page. The next drawing stopped him. It was an evening gown in black, gray, and muted gold. The skirt broke into overlapping panels that resembled train tracks seen from above. At the center, thin lines curved outward like sound waves. The bodice appeared severe from a distance, but the closer he looked, the more delicate the construction became. "What is this called?" he asked. "It doesn't have a name." "It should. I drew it after my first night shift. The station was almost empty, but every sound kept traveling. Shoes, announcements, luggage wheels. It felt like the building remembered everyone who had passed through it." Julian stared at the page. He had spent 6 years trying to create a collection about memory and repair. Annie had captured both ideas with a pencil stub on the back of a discarded train schedule. He closed the portfolio carefully. Annie searched his face. "Is it bad?" "No." "Then what is wrong with it?" "The structure is inconsistent. Some of these garments cannot be made as drawn." Your proportions drift, and you use color before deciding what the fabric is supposed to do. Her expression tightened, but she nodded. Julian continued, your hands do not yet understand what your eyes are seeing. Annie looked down at the portfolio. That sounds like a polite way of saying I'm not good enough. It means you have something training cannot give you, and lack several things training can. She looked back at him. Is that good? It is rare. The radiator knocked twice behind them. Annie seemed to forget to breathe. Julian rested one hand on the cardboard portfolio. Do not throw any of this away. I wasn't planning to. Do not show it to anyone who asks to borrow it. Do not send original files without keeping dated copies. And do not sign anything you have not read. That is a strange list. It is the list I should have taught every young designer who entered my company. For the first time, the bitterness in his voice was not directed at Marcus. It was directed inward. Annie gathered the drawings and retied the shoelace around the portfolio. You should sleep, she said. So should you. I have to check Grandma's medication first. Julian watched her carry the portfolio back toward the bedroom. In his world, talent arrived with assistants, portfolios printed on heavy paper, and parents who knew which names to call. Here it had been living above a grocery store, drawing on discarded schedules after cleaning floors all night. He looked toward the old sewing box beneath the window. Until that moment, he had believed the worst thing Marcus stole was a collection. Now Julian understood there were quieter thefts happening every day, gifts overlooked because they appeared in the wrong neighborhood, in the wrong uniform, or in the hands of someone no one important had bothered to notice. By morning, the storm had weakened to a gray drizzle. Julian woke on Ruth's sofa, with one foot hanging over the armrest, and the borrowed sweatshirt pulled tight across his shoulders. For several seconds, he did not remember where he was. Then he heard dishes in the kitchen, and Annie reminding her grandmother to take the blue pill before breakfast. His phone remained switched off on the table. Ruth was pouring coffee when he entered the kitchen. Annie had already changed into jeans and a faded green sweater. Her maintenance uniform hung near the radiator, still damp at the cuffs. There's oatmeal, Ruth said, or eggs if you can cook them yourself. Oatmeal is fine. Good. Eggs cost too much this week. Julian sat at the small table. The cardboard portfolio was no longer there, but he could still see the sketches in his mind. The coat that seemed to move before its wearer, the evening gown made from the sounds of an empty station, the formal dress designed around a cane. He had spent decades searching for originality in private schools, expensive internships, and studios filled with people trained to explain every decision. Annie had never entered any of those rooms, yet she saw clothing as a form of care. You should study design, he said. Annie stirred cinnamon into her oatmeal. I should do a lot of things. I'm serious. So Annie, Julian leaned forward. I can arrange for you to meet the right people. I can provide a studio, materials, tuition, whatever you need. Annie stopped stirring. Ruth looked from one of them to the other but said nothing. Julian continued. Your grandmother's medical bills can be handled as well. There is no reason for you to work nights while trying to build a portfolio. Annie placed the spoon beside her bowl. You've known me less than 12 hours. That does not change what I saw. No, but it changes what you know. I know talent when it is in front of me, and I know what pity sounds like. The words landed harder than she intended. Julian's expression closed. This is not pity. You found me cleaning a train station. You saw Grandma's medicine in the old building, and now you want to fix everything before breakfast. I am offering you an opportunity. You are offering to take control. Ruth lifted her coffee but did not drink. Julian looked at Annie as he might have looked at a junior designer who had challenged him in a meeting. Do you understand how many young artists would accept this without hesitation? Then help one of them. I am talking about you, and I'm telling you I don't want to become a charity story attached to your comeback. The room went quiet. Julian's jaw tightened. You think I would use you to repair my reputation? I think you are hurt, frightened, and used to solving problems with money. That does not make you cruel. It does mean you might not know the difference between helping someone and deciding what their life should become. He pushed his chair back. I should go. Ruth finally spoke. Sit down. Julian looked at her. You heard me. I don't believe I am welcome. You are welcome. Your offer is not. Annie lowered her eyes, but Ruth continued before either of them could speak. A gift stops being a gift when the person receiving it must hand over her pride in exchange. I asked for nothing in return, Julian said. Not aloud. His face hardened again. Ruth set down her cup. You are used to rooms where people are afraid to disagree with you. This is not one of those rooms. Julian said nothing. Annie does not need a savior, Ruth continued. She needs someone who will tell her when a line is weak, when a color is dishonest, and when she is hiding behind fear. If you want to do that, say so. But do not walk into her life waving checks as though every problem has a price. Julian looked toward Annie. She appeared uncomfortable now, but she did not take back what she had said. What do you want? He asked her. The question was sharper than he intended, but Annie answered calmly. I want to know if I'm good enough to belong in that world. You are not. Her face changed. Not yet, he added. Your instincts are strong. Your construction knowledge is poor. Your proportions are inconsistent. You rely on emotion where discipline is required, and you do not know how to protect your work. Annie held his gaze. Julian continued. But those things can be taught. And the rest? The rest is the reason I am still sitting here. Ruth leaned back in her chair. That sounds more useful. Annie considered him for a long moment. I have work tonight. I can send a car. No. I can adjust to your schedule. I also take care of Grandma. I heard you. And I'm not quitting my job because you think I should. Julian stood. Then we have nothing more to discuss. He took his coat from the radiator. It was still slightly damp, but he put it on anyway. Annie followed him to the door. Mr. Ashford, you were clear. I didn't say no forever. You said enough. He stepped into the hallway before she could answer. The trip downtown took nearly an hour. By the time Julian reached the garment district, his phone was back on and filled with messages. Nathan Cole wanted to discuss legal strategy. 3 board members demanded a public apology. Marcus had called 6 times. Julian ignored them all and entered a small building on West 38th Street. The studio on the 4th floor had been locked for 11 years. It was the first workspace he had rented before Ashford Maison had offices, investors, or a communications department. Dust covered the cutting table. Rolls of forgotten fabric leaned against the wall. A rusted clothing rack stood beneath the windows. Julian opened an old cabinet and found a wooden box. Inside were the pencils he had used in his 20s, worn short from years of sharpening by hand. Beneath them lay several fabric swatches from his first collection and a black sketchbook with his mother's handwriting on the inside cover. Draw what you see, not what you think people will buy. He sat at the cutting table and remained there until the afternoon light faded. 3 days passed before he returned to Harlem. This time there was no driver waiting outside, no assistant carrying boxes, and no envelope containing money. Julian climbed the stairs alone with the wooden pencil case beneath one arm and a blank sketchbook in his hand. Annie opened the door. Her surprise lasted only a second. I thought we had nothing more to discuss. I was angry. I noticed. I am not good at being refused. I noticed that too. Julian held out the pencil case. These are not a gift. They are tools. You may return them when you no longer need them. Annie did not take the box. What are you offering now? 3 afternoons a week. No tuition. No publicity. No contracts giving me ownership of your work. I teach. You decide what to do with what you learn. And Grandma's bills? None of my business unless she asks. Ruth called from the kitchen. I will not. Julian raised his voice slightly. Understood. Annie's mouth moved as though she were trying not to smile. One more condition, she said. You tell me the truth, even when it's bad. I have never known how to lie about art. She accepted the pencil case. Julian handed her the blank sketchbook, then write today's date on the first page. From now on, every idea gets a date. Every draft gets saved. And no original leaves your hands without a copy. Annie opened the cover. For someone accused of stealing, she said. You seem very concerned about ownership. Julian met her eyes. That is exactly why. The following Tuesday, Annie arrived at the old studio on West 38th Street 12 minutes early. Julian was already there. He had opened the tall windows despite the January cold, and the room smelled of dust, wool, and the bitter coffee he had left untouched on the cutting table. The studio was smaller than Annie had imagined. There were no marble floors, mirrored walls, or assistants moving through the room with garment bags. Only a scarred wooden table, 2 dress forms, several racks of fabric, and an industrial sewing machine old enough to have belonged to another century. This is where you started? Annie asked. This is where I learned how little I knew. She set the wooden pencil case and black sketchbook on the table. I thought famous people usually say they knew they were destined for greatness. Famous people lie in interviews. Julian took her coat and hung it near the radiator. On the table, he had placed a single square of black wool. "What do you see?" he asked. "A piece of black fabric." "That is what it is." I asked what you see. Annie leaned closer. "Something heavy." "What else?" "It absorbs the light. All dark fabric does that." "Not in the same way." Julian waited. She lifted one corner and rubbed it between her fingers. "It feels protective, like something worn by a person who doesn't want strangers to know what shape they are." Julian's expression changed slightly. "Better." He turned on a work lamp and moved it from one side of the table to the other. The wool shifted from flat black to charcoal, then revealed a faint blue tone along the weave. "Darkness is never one color," he said. "People call something black because they have stopped looking closely. An artist cannot afford that." Annie opened the sketchbook. "Write the date." She did. "Now draw the fabric." "Just the square?" "Draw what changes when the light moves." Annie worked for 15 minutes. Julian stood behind her without speaking. When she finished, he studied the page. "You are drawing what you think fabric should look like." "I'm drawing what's in front of me." "No, you're drawing a symbol of folded cloth. Your eyes saw more than your hand recorded." He took one of his old pencils but did not touch her drawing. On a separate sheet, he made 4 quick lines, showing the change in tension where the wool bent across the table's edge. Annie watched. "You make it look easy." "It is easy after 30 years. That is not encouraging. It is not meant to be." He returned the pencil to the box. Again. By the 4th attempt, Annie's wrist ached. The second drawing had been too stiff. The third had exaggerated the shadows. In the 4th, she stopped trying to impress him and followed the changes in the fabric one line at a time. Julian looked at it for several seconds. "This one is honest." "Is that another way of saying it's good?" "No. It means we can work with it." Annie exhaled and leaned back. "You really don't know how to compliment people. Compliments are useful after the work is done. Before that, they are often a distraction." She closed the sketchbook halfway. "Did you always teach like this?" "I rarely taught." "Why?" "I was too impatient." "And now?" "I am still impatient." "That wasn't the question." Julian looked toward the window. "Now I understand impatience is expensive. It produces assistants who are afraid to ask questions and executives who learn to hide mistakes." Marcus's name remained unspoken, but Annie heard it in the pause. Julian crossed to a cabinet and removed several fabric swatches. He laid silk, cotton, linen, velvet, and synthetic satin across the table. "Close your eyes." She gave him a doubtful look. "If I intended to rob you, I would not have waited until you brought back my pencils." Annie closed her eyes. He placed a piece of fabric in her hands. "Tell me what it is." "Silk." "What kind?" "I don't know." "Then do not pretend you do. Describe it." She moved the fabric across her fingertips. "It's cool at first. It slips away when I try to hold it flat. It would show every mistake in the cut." Julian replaced it with another. "This one is warmer, softer. It doesn't move as quickly." "Cashmere." "Expensive?" "Very." She opened one eye. "I can tell by the way you said it." "Close your eyes." By the end of the exercise, Annie could not name every material, but she had described how each one resisted, folded, reflected light, and reacted to the warmth of her hands. Julian collected the swatches. "You see clothing as an image. That is not enough. Fabric has weight, memory, and limits. If you ignore those things, your design becomes a drawing that can never live on a body." "What if the fabric limits the idea?" "Then the idea was incomplete." Annie wrote the sentence in the margin of her sketchbook. Julian noticed. "You do not need to record everything I say. I'm deciding later which parts are useful." He almost smiled. At noon, she opened a canvas bag and removed 2 containers of soup, 4 slices of cornbread wrapped in foil, and the silver thermos. "Grandma said you probably forgot to eat." "I did not forget." "When did you have breakfast?" Julian said nothing. "That means you forgot." They ate at the cutting table. Ruth's soup was thicker than the one she had served during the storm, with white beans, tomatoes, and smoked turkey. Julian reached for the pepper before tasting it. Annie noticed. "You're learning." "I am adapting." "Grandma would call that learning." He tore a piece of cornbread. "Your grandmother enjoys correcting me." She says powerful men rarely receive enough practice. After lunch, Julian brought out a dress form and handed Annie a length of inexpensive muslin. No drawing this time. What am I supposed to do with it? Make the form express fear. Annie stared at him. With plain cloth? If you need color and decoration to communicate emotion, then you are not controlling shape. She draped the muslin over the form, pinning it tightly across the chest. Julian shook his head. That is discomfort, not fear. She loosened it and tried again, folding the material around the shoulders. That is hiding. Isn't hiding part of fear? Sometimes, but decide whose fear this is. Annie stood still. The question changed the assignment. She stopped treating the dress form as an object and imagined a woman waiting alone on a platform after midnight. Hearing footsteps behind her, she pulled the fabric backward from one shoulder as though the body had begun to turn before the feet could move. The front remained controlled, but the back twisted away. Julian walked around the form. Why is the neckline so calm? Because she doesn't want anyone to know she's afraid. He looked at Annie. Now it has a point of view. The words meant more to her than praise. By late afternoon, the winter light had faded from the windows. Annie photographed every stage of the draping exercise, saved the images in a dated folder, and placed her sketches in a protective sleeve Julian had provided. At the door, she turned back. Are these lessons only until your company crisis is over? Julian looked across the room at the muslin figure, its body caught between stillness and flight. No. How long then? Until you no longer need what I can teach. Annie considered the answer. And if that happens sooner than you expect, then I will have done the job correctly. She nodded and left for her night shift. Julian remained alone in the studio. On the cutting table sat Annie's first discarded sketch, a few crumbs of Ruth's cornbread, and the black wool they had studied that morning. For years, every new project had begun with his name, a budget, and a deadline. This one had begun with two people writing the same date on separate pages and agreeing that neither of them would own what belonged to the other. Over the next 4 weeks, Annie learned that Julian could turn almost anything into a lesson. He asked her to study the blue-gray shadow beneath an elevated train, the orange light inside a 24-hour diner, and the faded green coat worn by a woman who sold newspapers near Grand Central. He made her sketch hands holding grocery bags, backs bent over strollers, and the way tired people loosened their clothes when they believed no one was watching. Fashion begins before the fabric, he told her. It begins with the reason someone needs to wear it. Annie still worked 5 night shifts each week. She left Grand Central shortly after sunrise, slept for a few hours, helped Ruth with errands and medical appointments, then traveled downtown to the studio 3 afternoons a week. Julian never commented on the dark circles beneath her eyes, but he began keeping coffee, fruit, and plain bagels in the small refrigerator. He claimed the food was for himself, though he rarely touched it until Annie arrived. One Thursday, she found him standing beside the cutting table with 2 paper cups. You put sugar in this, she said after tasting hers. You used 4 packets last time. I used 3. You took 1 from my coffee. That does not make 4. It does, mathematically. Annie shook her head and opened her sketchbook. You remember how much sugar I use, but you forgot the meeting your lawyer called about. Nathan will call again. He already called 6 times. Julian's phone was vibrating near the window. He turned it face down. The investigation into the stolen collection had made little public progress. Ashford Maison remained under temporary management, while Marcus appeared on television promising transparency and compassion for Elliot Gray's family. Each interview made Julian quieter. Annie had learned not to ask questions when his silence was still closed. Instead, she placed a sheet of paper before him. I need help with this sleeve. Julian examined the drawing. It is not a sleeve. It is attached to the shoulder. So is an arm. That does not make it a sleeve. She waited. The shape is decorative, he continued. It says nothing about the person wearing it. She's a night nurse. Then why would she wear fabric that catches on every door handle? Annie looked again. Because I liked the shape. That is not enough. She erased the wide cuff and replaced it with a narrower opening that could be rolled back. Then she added a hidden pocket along the inside seam. For what? Julian asked. A phone, maybe gloves, hospital identification cards. She made the pocket deeper. Julian nodded once. Now you are designing for a life instead of a photograph. During another lesson, he brought her a box of fabric remnants without labels. Annie had to arrange them by the emotions they suggested rather than by color or price. She placed rough brown wool beside pale silk. Julian frowned. Explain. The wool feels like someone who has worked outside all day. The silk feels like the clean shirt they put on before visiting someone in the hospital. That is sentimental. It can still be true. Sentiment without structure becomes decoration. Structure without feeling becomes a uniform. Julian looked at her for a long moment, then moved the fabrics closer together. Show me how they belong in the same garment. Annie began pinning the wool into a simple coat, while allowing the silk to appear only inside the collar and cuffs. For the person wearing it? He asked. So they know something soft is there even if no one else sees it. Julian did not criticize the choice. Their lessons gradually moved beyond the studio. One afternoon, Annie took him through Grand Central before her shift and pointed out people she had watched for months. A conductor adjusted his tie in the reflection of a darkened ticket window before leaving work. An elderly woman had sewn a bright red star over a tear in her grandson's jacket. A hotel porter wore reflective tape around one sleeve because the other strip had peeled away. Two office workers changed from dress shoes into sneakers before walking to the subway. None of them are trying to be fashionable, Julian said. They're trying to get through the day. That is often the more honest design problem. They stopped near a bench beneath the main clock. It was not the same bench where Annie had found him, but Julian still glanced toward the place. My mother used to change shoes on the subway, he said. She wore cheap flats to work and carried her good pair in a paper bag. Annie had heard only fragments about his mother. She knew the woman had been a seamstress and had died before Ashford Maison became an international company. What were the good shoes for? Annie asked. Customers. She believed wealthy women trusted a seamstress more if her shoes were polished. Did it work? No, they still forgot her name. Julian watched the crowd move beneath the painted ceiling. She worked on gowns she could never afford. Sometimes the women complained about the price while wearing jewelry worth more than our apartment. Did that make her angry? It made me angry. She said anger was useful only if you gave it a job. Annie smiled. Grandma says something similar. Older women enjoy turning difficult truths into short sentences. They have less time to waste. That evening, Julian returned to the studio after Annie began her shift. He told himself he only wanted to organize the fabric samples, but he remained at the cutting table long after midnight. For months, he had been unable to draw without seeing the stolen collection. Every line reminded him of Marcus, the forged emails, and the public accusations. This time, he thought about his mother's shoes in the paper bag. He sketched a coat made for a woman who moved between two worlds, durable wool on the outside, a narrow line of silk hidden beneath the collar, and pockets large enough to carry the things she did not want strangers to see. He made 3 versions before dawn. When Annie entered the studio the following afternoon, she found the pages spread across the table. You drew these? Julian looked up from his coffee. That is usually what it means when my name is at the bottom. They're new. Yes. She touched the corner of one page without lifting it. They don't look like rebirth. The observation should have bothered him. Instead, it brought relief. No, he said, they don't. Annie studied the designs. The inside is softer than the outside. Some people need it that way. She looked at him, aware that they were no longer discussing the coat. Julian gathered the sketches and placed them in a dated folder. For the first time since the scandal began, creating something new did not feel like defending his past. A week later, he asked Annie to prepare 6 pieces for a portfolio. She stopped sorting fabric. For what? A preliminary review. By whom? Evelyn Brooks. She directs a foundation program at Parsons. Annie's hands became still. You said you wouldn't buy me a place. I am not buying anything. Evelyn owes me no favors and dislikes me enough to prove it. That is supposed to reassure me? It should. She will tell you the truth. Annie looked down at her unfinished sketches. What if she says I don't belong there? Julian remembered a younger version of himself standing outside a design school in Brooklyn, afraid to enter because everyone inside appeared to know rules he had never been taught. Then you will ask why, he said. You will learn what can be learned, reject what is dishonest, and return to work. And if she says yes, then the work becomes harder. Annie closed the portfolio slowly. You make every good possibility sound threatening. Good possibilities usually are. She carried the 6 drawings home that evening, holding them against her chest on the subway. Julian remained in the studio. studying the new coat he had drawn from the memory of his mother. He had believed teaching Annie would give him something useful to do while his own life was suspended. Instead, she had done something no board member, attorney, or public relations expert had managed. She had made him curious about what he might create next. Evelyn Brooks reviewed Annie's portfolio on a Tuesday afternoon in a narrow office overlooking West 13th Street. She wore black-framed glasses and turned each page without changing expression. Julian sat near the window, saying nothing. Annie had expected him to explain the unfinished seams, the cheap paper, or why several designs had been drawn on the backs of train schedules. He did not. When Evelyn reached the final sketch, she closed the portfolio. "You have strong instincts," she said. Annie waited. "Your technical training is limited, your perspective slips, and some of these garments cannot be constructed as drawn." "I know. Do you?" "Mr. Ashford reminds me often." Evelyn glanced at Julian. "That sounds like him." Julian crossed one leg over the other. "You asked me not to interfere. I was checking whether you were capable." Annie looked between them. "Am I being rejected?" "No," Evelyn said. "I'm offering you a place in the weekend preparatory program. 8 weeks. No guarantee of admission, no special grading, and no private corrections from Mr. Ashford. I don't correct her work before reviews. You correct the air around other people until they agree with you." Julian seemed ready to argue, but Annie spoke first. "I accept." Evelyn handed her a printed schedule. "Classes begin Saturday at 9. Bring charcoal, tracing paper, a measuring tape, and something you are not afraid to ruin." The first Saturday, Annie arrived 20 minutes early with Ruth's canvas sewing bag over one shoulder. Inside were Julian's pencils, a second-hand measuring tape, 2 notebooks, and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Students gathered outside the classroom in small groups. Most wore clothes designed to look casual but expensive. One young man described a summer program in Florence. 2 girls compared portfolio consultants. Another student complained that her mother had sent the wrong car. Annie stood near the door and read the supply list again. A blonde girl in a cream sweater noticed the canvas bag. "Is that vintage?" she asked. "It belonged to my grandmother." The girl touched the worn handle. "I love that. Everything authentic looks better when it's distressed." It wasn't distressed on purpose. The girl smiled as though Annie had made a joke. "I'm Madison Vale." "Annie Carter." Recognition flickered across Madison's face. "You're Julian Ashford's girl." "I'm not his girl." "His project, then." Before Annie could answer, Evelyn opened the classroom door. The morning assignment required students to build a paper garment around a dress form without using tape. Annie began folding and locking the paper into narrow sections that spread from the shoulder like overlapping train platforms. Madison worked at the next table. Her supplies came from a hard leather case stamped with her initials. "So what does Ashford make you call him?" she asked. "Julian." Madison raised an eyebrow. "That's intimate." "He's my teacher." "Right." Annie kept folding. At lunch, she ate her sandwich in the hallway. A boy named Tyler sat across from her and glanced at her shoes. "Do you really clean Grand Central?" he asked. "Yes. I thought the articles exaggerated that." "What articles?" He looked embarrassed. "Just posts. People said Ashford found you during some kind of breakdown." Annie folded the wax paper around the remains of her sandwich. "People say many things about strangers. I didn't mean anything by it. That does not make it harmless." By the third weekend, the questions had become comments. Madison called Annie the scholarship story when she thought Evelyn could not hear. Someone photographed Annie's worn shoes beneath the work table and posted them with the caption, "Coucher starts in custodial services." Annie deleted the image from her phone and said nothing to Julian. She did not want him entering Parsons with attorneys, administrators, and the expression that made experienced executives forget what they had planned to say. More than that, she did not want anyone believing she could survive only when a powerful white man stood behind her. The next assignment was to design an evening garment using painted paper. Annie stayed late Friday night at Grand Central, sketching the movement of commuters beneath the departure board. She created a structured coat dress in deep blue, with silver lines crossing the skirt like intersecting tracks. On Saturday morning, she left the unfinished painting on her table while Evelyn called the class into the fitting room for a demonstration. When Annie returned, a jar of red paint lay on its side. Color had spread across the center of her work. Madison stood near the sink washing a brush. "That's unfortunate," she said. Annie stared at the ruined paper. Tyler looked down. No one spoke. "Did you do this?" Annie asked. Madison dried her hands. "Are you accusing me?" "I'm asking. Maybe you should be more careful with your things." The red paint had soaked through the paper. 3 nights of work were gone. Annie began gathering her supplies. Evelyn entered and stopped. "What happened?" "No one knows," Madison said. Evelyn looked at Annie. "Do you want to file a report?" Annie could feel every student watching her. "No." "Annie." I said no. She rolled the ruined work inward so no one could see her hands shaking. That afternoon, Julian arrived early to collect several archived books he had lent Evelyn. He found Annie alone at a work table, trying to redraw the damaged design from memory. He saw the red stains on the discarded paper beside her. "What happened?" "En accident." Julian picked up the ruined sheet. Paint does not pour itself across the center of a finished composition. It's handled. It does not appear handled. Annie continued drawing. "I don't need you to fix this." "I did not say you did. You're already deciding who to call." He looked toward the other students gathering near the door. Madison lowered her eyes. "Who did it?" Annie put down her pencil. "That's not the question. It is the first question. No, the question is whether my work is good enough when my name, my job, and my connection to you are removed." Julian's jaw tightened. "Someone destroyed your property. And if you have them removed, they'll say I stayed because Julian Ashford frightened the school. What would you prefer?" "A fair review." Evelyn, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped inside. "Then we will have one." The following week, every student received the same assignment. Create a design representing the sound of New York after midnight. Names, photographs, and personal statements would be removed before the faculty panel saw the work. "No biographies," Evelyn told the class. "No family connections. No schools. No explanations. The work enters the room alone." Madison raised her hand. "How do we know outside help won't influence the results?" Evelyn looked directly at Julian, who stood near the back wall. "Mr. Ashford will not see Annie's work until after the review." Julian nodded. On the subway home, Annie held the blank assignment sheet across her knees. "You agreed too quickly," she said. "To what?" "Not seeing my work. If it fails, it should fail honestly. And if it succeeds, then no one can say I carried it into the room." Annie looked out at the dark tunnel beyond the window. For the first time since joining the program, she was about to be judged in a room where her uniform, her neighborhood, and the color of her skin would not arrive before her work. That should have made her feel safe. Instead, it left her with nowhere to hide. Annie spent the next 6 nights listening to the city after midnight. She stood near the lower concourse at Grand Central and recorded sounds in a small notebook. The click of a conductor's punch, the scrape of suitcase wheels, the pause before a departure announcement, the low groan of a train entering the tunnel. She watched workers in reflective vests cross the platform after the last rush of commuters had passed, their bodies briefly illuminated by the lights of arriving trains. The assignment asked for a design inspired by sound. Annie did not want to draw music. She wanted to draw the way a city continued breathing after most people had gone home. Julian kept his promise and did not look at her work. At the studio, he taught her how to draft a sleeve while her portfolio remained closed on the opposite side of the room. Twice, she caught him glancing toward it. "You said you wouldn't look," she reminded him. "I am not looking. You're considering looking. Considering something is not the same as doing it. It usually comes first." Julian returned to the patterned paper. "Your sleeve cap is too high." Annie turned the portfolio face down. She built the final design in deep blue and charcoal. Narrow silver lines crossed the skirt at different angles, echoing subway tracks viewed from above. Along the shoulders, she placed bands of reflective material used on work uniforms. They remained dull in ordinary light but flashed when viewed from certain directions. The garment was not meant for a woman posing under perfect lighting. It was meant for someone moving through a city that noticed her only in fragments. Ruth helped her cut the first muslin sample at the kitchen table. "This seam is pulling," Ruth said. Julian would say the same thing. "Then the man occasionally has good sense." Annie adjusted the paper pattern. "Do you think it looks too much like a uniform?" Ruth held the sketch farther from her face. "A uniform tells the world what work you do. This tells the world the person doing that work still has a life inside her." On the morning of the review, Annie carried the garment to Parsons in a plain black bag marked only with the number Evelyn had assigned her. No student names appeared in the room. Every sketchbook, process board, and garment carried a number instead. Faculty members from several departments moved from one display to the next while the students waited on another floor. Julian was not permitted inside the building until the scoring ended. He waited at a diner across the street with a cup of coffee he did not drink. Nathan called while Julian watched the Parsons entrance through the window. "We traced another account connected to the stolen files," Nathan said. "The money passed through a consulting company in Delaware. Connected to Stone? Not directly yet. Marcus? We need proof before we use his name." Julian's grip tightened around the phone. He had access. So did 5 other people. Suspicion is not evidence. Julian looked across the street. Annie had entered the building 2 hours earlier and had not come out. "Call me when suspicion becomes useful." He ended the call. Inside Parsons, Annie sat between Tyler and another student, while Evelyn entered the waiting room carrying a clipboard. "The faculty has finished the first review," Evelyn said. "3 designs will move to the final discussion." Madison crossed her legs. "Do we get to know the numbers?" "Yes." Evelyn read them. The 3rd number belonged to Tyler. The 2nd belonged to a student from Queens who had barely spoken during class. The 1st was Annie's. She stared at the number on her card to make certain she had not misread it. Madison did not look at her. The students were allowed into the review room for the faculty discussion. Annie's garment stood at the center beneath a track light. The reflective lines caught the light as people moved around it, appearing and disappearing with each change in angle. A professor of textile design pointed toward the shoulders. "The material is industrial. It is used in transit uniforms," another faculty member said. "The construction is uneven along the left side." "Yes, but the decision is clear." A 3rd professor studied Annie's process board. "The designer began with recordings from a station. The lines correspond to sound intervals and train routes." Madison raised her hand. "Are students allowed to receive outside professional help?" Evelyn's expression remained neutral. "Do you have evidence that any entry received outside assistance?" "No. I'm only asking because one student has access to a famous designer." The faculty members looked toward Annie. Evelyn turned to her. "Entry 47 is yours?" "Yes." "Did Julian Ashford contribute to this design?" "No, he did not see it before today." Madison gave a small laugh. "We are supposed to take her word for that." Annie felt heat rise into her face, but she did not look at Julian's empty chair near the back wall. He was not there to answer for her. That had been the point. She walked to her display and opened the process book. The first pages contained dates, sound notes, platform sketches, failed structures, and fabric tests. She showed the faculty 3 versions of the shoulder line and 2 discarded skirt patterns. "The first version looked dramatic, but no one could walk in it," she explained. "The second moved better, but the reflective strips became decoration. I changed the angle so the light appears only when the wearer moves." She placed a transit map beside the final pattern. "The crossing lines come from the routes used by workers leaving Grand Central after midnight. The garment is about people who keep the city running when most of us are no longer watching." One professor touched the edge of the fabric. "Why use inexpensive wool?" "Because the person who inspired it could not afford luxury cloth. I wanted the design to respect her life, not erase it." No one spoke for several seconds. Madison folded her arms. "That does not prove Mr. Ashford didn't help." Annie looked directly at her. "You praised this design before you knew who made it." Madison's expression changed. Annie continued, "When it had no name, it was original. Now that you know it belongs to me, you need another explanation for why it is good." "That is not what I said. It is what keeps happening." Evelyn did not interrupt. Annie turned toward the panel. "I am not asking anyone to lower the standard for me. I am asking you not to change the standard after you see my face." The room became still. The final scores were posted 20 minutes later. Annie's design ranked first. When she walked outside, Julian was standing across the street beside the diner entrance. He did not ask whether she had won. He looked at her face and already knew. "You were not in the room," she said. "You told me not to be. I thought you might come anyway." "So did I." Annie held out the scoring sheet. Julian read it, then returned it to her. "You did not need me in that room." Her smile faded slightly. "I needed to know you were outside." Julian nodded. They began walking toward the subway as light snow started to fall between the buildings. Behind them, students continued leaving Parsons, carrying portfolios that looked much like Annie's from a distance. For one morning, her work had entered a room without her address, her uniform, or Julian's name attached to it. It had spoken before anyone else could speak for her. 3 days after the blind review, Evelyn handed Annie an application for the citywide Young Artists competition. The theme is simple, she said. Create a portrait of someone who changed the way you see the world. Annie looked at the form. A portrait? It can be literal or symbolic. Painting, mixed media, charcoal, textile work. The final piece must be entirely your own. Madison, working at the next table, glanced over but said nothing. Evelyn lowered her voice. The deadline is in 4 weeks. Enter only if you have something worth saying. Annie folded the application and placed it inside her sketchbook. That evening, she showed it to Ruth at the kitchen table. Ruth was sorting pills into a weekly organizer while a pot of collard greens simmered on the stove. Who are you thinking of painting? Ruth asked. I don't know yet. That means you do know and don't want to say. Annie took a glass from the cabinet. Why does everyone in this family talk like they can read minds? Because you make the same face your mother made when she was hiding something. The answer quieted Annie. She sat across from Ruth and unfolded the application again. What if the person I choose thinks I'm trying to flatter him? Then paint him honestly enough that he cannot. The following afternoon, Annie arrived at the Garment District studio with a stretched canvas wrapped in brown paper. She placed it behind an unused dress form before Julian could see it. What is that? He asked. An assignment. What kind? The kind you're not allowed to supervise. Julian looked offended. I am capable of respecting boundaries. You considered opening my portfolio 3 times during the blind review. I did not open it. You looked at the zipper. A zipper is not confidential. Annie moved the canvas farther behind the dress form. This is. For the next 2 weeks, she worked on the painting after her night shift. She used a storage room near the maintenance office when it was empty, covering the floor with discarded cardboard. The canvas was too large to carry back and forth each day, so she hid it behind stacks of unused caution signs and cleaning supplies. She began with Julian's face, not the face from magazine covers, where every shadow had been controlled and every line softened by lighting. She painted the man she had found beneath the clock at Grand Central. Wet hair fallen across his forehead, one shoulder lower than the other. His eyes fixed on a future he could no longer see. Half of his face remained in deep blue and charcoal. The other half caught the amber light of the station lamps. Behind him, Annie painted train tracks that rose from the floor and changed into long strips of fabric. Some were torn. Others were held together by visible red stitches. Near the lower edge of the canvas, she added the silver thermos between 2 hands. She painted her own hand smaller and darker against Julian's pale fingers, but she did not include her face. The light came from the space between them. One night, a fellow maintenance worker named Carmen found Annie standing before the unfinished portrait. That's him, Carmen said. Annie wiped paint from her thumb. It's supposed to be. No, I mean that's really him. He looks terrible. He was having a terrible night. Carmen stepped closer. You made him look sad but not weak. Annie studied the painting. He thought they were the same thing. When the portrait was nearly finished, she brought it to Ruth. Ruth sat in her armchair with a blanket over her knees and examined it without speaking. Annie had learned not to rush her. Finally, Ruth pointed toward the thermos. You made that too clean. It was clean. It had a dent near the bottom. You dropped it outside the clinic last spring. Annie smiled. No one will notice. You will. Annie repainted the dent. What are you calling it? Ruth asked. The man who lit the darkness. Ruth looked from the painting to her granddaughter. Did he? He taught me how to see what I was already looking at. That is not the same as giving you light. No. Ruth touched Annie's wrist. Make sure the title does not turn him into your whole story. Annie returned to the painting and added more light between the 2 hands, widening it until it touched both figures without belonging to either one. The competition exhibition opened on a Friday evening at a public gallery in Chelsea. Annie wore a navy dress Ruth had altered from one found at a thrift store. Julian arrived late and entered through a side door to avoid the reporters still following him. His lawyers had advised him not to attend. Nathan had been direct. Every photograph of you beside Annie will be interpreted. Some outlets will call it mentorship. Others will call it image repair. She asked me to come, then understand the risk. Julian had come anyway. He moved through the gallery without speaking to anyone until he reached Annie's portrait. For several seconds, he did not recognize himself. The man on the canvas did not resemble the person Ashford Mason had spent years presenting to the world. He looked tired, frightened, and stripped of every defense. Yet the painting did not humiliate him. It allowed him to remain human. Annie stood a few feet away, watching his reaction. "You painted me crying." "You were crying. I had hoped memory might improve me." "That would be dishonest." Julian looked at the title card. "The Man Who Lit the Darkness," he read. "You don't like it. It is inaccurate." Annie folded her hands. "Which part?" "You were the one who approached me. You gave me the tea. You stayed. You taught me that black fabric can hold blue, gray, and violet if someone looks closely enough. That hardly makes me a source of light." Annie stepped beside him. "Maybe light doesn't belong to one person. Maybe it only matters that someone passes it on." Julian looked again at the two painted hands and the glow between them. His eyes filled, but he did not turn away. A photographer near the gallery entrance noticed them. Before either could react, the camera flashed. By midnight, the image was online. Julian Ashford standing beside Annie Carter beneath the portrait of his own collapse. Most comments were supportive. Some called the painting powerful. Others praised Julian for mentoring a young black artist without publicizing it. Marcus Hale saw something else. He sat alone in his office at Ashford Mason, the city spread beneath the windows, and enlarged the photograph on his screen. Julian looked different, not restored, but no longer defeated. Beside him stood Annie, young, talented, and credible in a way no corporate statement could manufacture. Marcus opened a private messaging application and sent the photograph to Gabriel Stone. "She is becoming a problem," Stone replied less than a minute later. "For whom?" Marcus looked at Annie's painted title again. "For both of us." He closed the gallery image and opened a folder containing security footage from Julian's old studio, internal scholarship forms, and photographs taken outside the Carter apartment. The first accusation had separated Julian from his company. The next one would make the public believe he had found someone poorer, younger, and easier to steal from. The first post appeared at 6:12 the next morning. By 7, 3 larger accounts had repeated it. By 8, a video of Julian criticizing Annie's work had been viewed more than 2 million times. The clip showed Annie standing beside a dress form in the old Garment District studio while Julian's voice cut through the room. "That line is weak. Start again." The recording ended before Annie's answer. "Good. I asked you not to be polite." A second clip showed Julian taking a sketch from her hands. A caption beneath it read, "Billionaire designer controls young black artist behind closed doors." Annie watched the video on her phone at the kitchen table while Ruth prepared toast. Her first reaction was confusion. The camera angle came from high in the corner of the studio. "Who recorded this?" she asked. Ruth looked over her shoulder. "Recorded what?" Before Annie could answer, another message appeared. Someone had uploaded a contract bearing her name and a scanned version of her signature. The document stated that Ashford Mason owned every design, painting, and concept Annie produced for the next 10 years. She read the page twice. "I never signed this." Ruth took the phone and adjusted her glasses. "That is your signature. It came from the Parsons application, or the competition form. I don't know." The phone began vibrating with messages from numbers Annie did not recognize. "How much did he pay you? Tell the truth before he destroys another black artist. You sold your story to a thief." One message contained a photograph of the red brick building where she and Ruth lived. Annie stood so quickly that the chair struck the wall. "Grandma, close the curtains." A news van was already parked across the street. By 9, reporters had gathered on the sidewalk. Some called Annie's name from below. Others questioned neighbors entering the grocery store. A woman with a microphone stood near the front steps and described Annie as an impoverished custodial worker, whose talent may have been appropriated by one of the most powerful men in fashion. No one had called Annie to ask whether the contract was real. Julian learned about the accusations from Nathan. He was in the old studio when his lawyer entered without knocking and placed a tablet on the cutting table. "Do not respond publicly," Nathan said. Julian watched the edited video once. Then again, that footage came from inside this room. "Yes, Marcus installed the security system." "I know." Julian opened the fake contract. "She never signed this. The signature appears to have been lifted from another document." "Then say that." "We will, after a document examiner confirms it. Annie is being accused now, and an emotional statement from you will feed the story Marcus wants." Julian struck the tablet against the table hard enough to make Nathan reach for it. He is using her because he cannot finish me. He is using the public's fear of exploitation, Nathan said. He made the lie believable because men with your money and influence have exploited young artists before. I did not. I know that. Evidence will matter more than anger. Julian's phone rang. Annie's name appeared. He answered at once. Annie? Her breathing was uneven. Behind her, voices pressed through the walls. They're outside the building. I'm sending security. No, that will make it look worse. I don't care how it looks. I do. This is my home. A loud pounding interrupted her. Someone in the hallway shouted her name. Ruth's voice followed, firm but strained. Step away from the door, Annie. Julian stood. I'm coming. Don't. I am not leaving you there. You coming here with cars and guards will turn this street into a circus. It already is one. Another voice rose outside the apartment. Mrs. Carter, how much money did Julian Ashford pay for your granddaughter's work? Annie heard Ruth inhale sharply. Grandma? The phone slipped against something hard. Julian heard movement, a chair scraping, then Annie scream. Grandma! The call ended. Julian was out of the studio before Nathan could stop him. By the time he reached Harlem, an ambulance blocked the street. Reporters crowded behind a police barrier, cameras raised toward the building entrance. Julian's driver tried to take him around the back, but he had already opened the door. The crowd recognized him. Questions struck from every direction. Did you forge Annie Carter's contract? Are her designs part of your new collection? Did Mrs. Carter suffer a heart attack because of this scandal? Julian kept moving. 2 paramedics brought Ruth through the entrance on a stretcher. An oxygen mask covered her face. Annie walked beside her, one hand gripping the rail. When Annie saw Julian, fear crossed her face before anger replaced it. I told you not to come. What happened? Her chest started hurting. She couldn't breathe. Julian moved toward the ambulance, but Annie stepped between him and the stretcher. Please, she said, not now. The doors closed, and the ambulance pulled away. Julian followed in his car to Hudson Presbyterian Medical Center. Reporters followed him. At the hospital, Annie sat beneath fluorescent lights with Ruth's coat folded across her knees. Her phone continued to fill with messages until she switched it off. Julian approached carefully. The doctor said she's stable, Annie said before he could ask. They're running tests. I'm sorry. She looked at him. You didn't put those people outside our home. No, but they came because of me. They came because someone lied, and because knowing me gave the lie somewhere to land. Annie lowered her gaze to Ruth's coat. They're saying I never made the work. Other people are saying I made everything and you stole it. No one seems to believe we could have worked together without one of us using the other. Julian sat across from her. Nathan will prove the contract is false. When? Soon. My grandmother is behind that door now. He had no answer. Annie opened her phone long enough to send one email. Then she shut it off again. What did you do? Julian asked. I withdrew from the competition. No. I can't have reporters following Ruth to her appointments because my painting hangs in a gallery. That is what Marcus wants. I know. Her voice shook. But knowing that doesn't make Grandma's heart stronger. Nathan arrived 20 minutes later carrying a folder. The contract is a forgery, he said. We have preliminary confirmation. The video was edited from studio security footage. We are tracing the source. Julian stood. Release everything. Not until the chain of evidence is secure. People are judging her while you secure paperwork. Nathan met his anger without moving. Justice is not fair when the wealthy get to tell their story first, and the poor spend years proving they were never lying. That is exactly why we cannot make a careless move now. Annie looked toward the closed treatment room doors. For months, Julian had taught her to protect her work with dates, copies, and evidence. None of it had protected Ruth from a stranger shouting through the door. Across the waiting room, a television showed Annie's face beside Julian's. The sound was muted, but the question beneath the image was clear. Mentorship or exploitation? Annie turned away. For the first time since the night at Grand Central, Julian understood that staying beside someone could hurt them as much as leaving. And by morning, he had begun to believe disappearing might be the only gift he had left to offer. Julian left Hudson Presbyterian shortly before dawn. Ruth remained under observation. Annie had fallen asleep in a chair beside her room, and Nathan was still speaking with the hospital's legal office about the reporters outside. No one saw Julian step into the elevator. By the time he reached the old studio, he had made 3 decisions. He would resign from Ashford Maison. He would transfer his voting shares to an independent trust until the investigation ended. And he would leave New York before Annie woke. He told himself it was not surrender. If his presence had turned her home into a target and sent Ruth to the emergency room, distance was the only protection he could still offer. He began packing without turning on the overhead lights. The room remained gray in the early morning, with only the street lamps filtering through the windows. He placed his mother's sketchbook in a leather case, followed by the silver scissors and several folders of personal work. He left Annie's sketches untouched. At 7, Nathan called. "You disappeared. I went to the studio. Annie asked where you were. What did you tell her?" "That I didn't know." "Good." Nathan was silent for a moment. "What are you doing?" "Ending this." "That is not an answer. I'm stepping down permanently. You will prepare the documents. Ashford Maison can issue a statement saying I will not return until the investigation is complete. And Annie? I will have no further contact with her." Nathan's voice hardened. "Did she ask for that?" "She should not have to. You do not get to decide what she needs without asking her. I thought Ruth made that clear." Julian closed the case. "Her grandmother nearly died because of a lie built around my name. Marcus built the lie. I gave him the power to do it. That is responsibility. This is punishment. It is protection. No, it is your oldest habit." Julian ended the call. A knock sounded at the studio door less than 5 minutes later. He assumed Nathan had followed him. But the woman standing in the hallway wore a camel coat, dark glasses, and the same steady expression that had once silenced entire backstage crews. Celeste Monroe removed her glasses. "You still hang up when someone says something true." Julian stepped aside. "How did you know I was here? You come back to this room whenever you want to remember who you were before people started applauding." She entered carrying a small black suitcase. Julian had not seen her in 6 years. At 55, Celeste still carried herself like the model who had once crossed a warehouse runway in Brooklyn wearing one of his first unfinished gowns while rain leaked through the roof. "You should not be here," he said. "Neither should that suitcase." She looked toward his packed case. "Where are you going?" "Somewhere my name cannot hurt anyone." Celeste set her suitcase on the cutting table. "That sounds noble. It is not meant to. It never is with you. You prefer your self-pity tailored." Julian's face tightened. "A woman is in the hospital, and the man who put her there is still controlling the story. Marcus will be investigated. Not if the people with evidence keep hiding." Celeste opened the suitcase. Inside were labeled folders, flash drives, printed emails, bank records, and 2 digital recorders sealed in plastic bags. Julian stared at them. "What is this?" Almost 9 years of Marcus believing no one was paying attention. She removed the first folder and placed it before him. It contained emails between Marcus and an outside consultant discussing payments from a Delaware company. Another folder held server access logs showing Marcus's credentials opening the Rebirth archive after midnight. Julian turned the pages faster. "Why did you have these?" "Because Marcus tried to make me lie about you years ago. He wanted me to say you had mistreated me during our first campaign. When I refused, he called me difficult and convinced the board I was too old for the brand." Celeste's tone remained calm, but Julian heard what it had cost her. "I thought you left because you wanted to retire. That is what Marcus told you." Julian stopped turning pages. Celeste placed a flash drive beside his hand. "That contains the full studio footage of you and Annie, not the edited clips, the complete files." "How did you get them?" "A former security technician owed me a favor. Marcus ordered him to copy everything from the old studio before deleting the remote backups." She added a bank transfer record. "This payment went from Gabriel Stone's intermediary to a consulting company controlled by Marcus's brother-in-law. 3 days later, Marcus accessed the Rebirth files." Julian looked at her. "Nathan needs to see this. He already has copies. He is verifying the chain of custody now." "You went to Nathan before coming here?" "I wanted one person in this city to behave rationally." Celeste opened another folder. Inside were the original emails from Elliot Gray's internship, alongside the altered versions released to the press. The messages were edited, sentences were moved, dates were changed, and Julian Elliot never claimed Rebirth was his. Julian sat down. For weeks, he had known the accusations were false. Seeing the mechanics of the deception was different. Marcus had not simply stolen a collection. He had rebuilt Julian's past into a weapon and used Elliot's death as its handle. Celeste watched him absorb it. "There is enough here to expose Marcus and Stone," she said. "There may be enough to charge them. Then give it to the authorities." "We are. Why do you need me?" "Because evidence can prove what happened. It cannot speak for Annie." Julian looked away. "She does not need me near her. She needs the truth near her. My presence made everything worse. Your silence made room for Marcus." Julian stood. "You think I should walk back into that hospital and ask her to stand beside me while the public tears her apart again? No, I think you should stop deciding for her." Celeste moved closer. "You have spent your life calling departure a form of sacrifice. Sometimes leaving is necessary. This is not one of those times. This is fear wearing an expensive coat." The words struck with the precision of an old friend who knew where every defense had been built. Julian looked at the packed case. "What if the truth is not enough?" Celeste's expression softened. "Truth is rarely enough by itself. It needs evidence, patience, and people willing to remain in the room after lying becomes easier." 2 hours later, Julian returned to Hudson Presbyterian. Annie was seated outside Ruth's room with a paper cup of coffee in her hands. She looked as though she had not slept. "You left," she said. "I did. Were you coming back?" Julian set the silver thermos on the chair between them. "I was planning not to." Annie looked at the thermos, then at him. "That was your solution?" "I thought removing myself would protect you. My grandmother is the one who taught you not to make decisions for other people. I am a slow student." Despite her exhaustion, something shifted in her face. Julian sat one chair away. "Celeste Monroe has evidence. Real evidence. Bank transfers, server logs, original emails, and the unedited recordings from the studio. Nathan is verifying everything. Will it prove the contract is fake?" "Yes." "And the collection?" "It will show Marcus sold it to Stone." Annie held the coffee cup tighter. "Will people believe it?" "I don't know." She studied him. "That is the first honest answer anyone has given me since yesterday." Julian nodded toward the thermos. "That night at Grand Central, you told me I did not have to carry my story alone." Annie's eyes filled, but she did not look away. "I came back to return the promise." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Annie asked, "What do we do?" "We stop reacting to Marcus. We choose where the truth is told." "Where?" Julian looked toward the hospital window, beyond it to the tracks and towers of Manhattan. "At the place where this began." Annie understood before he said the name. "Grand Central?" Julian nodded. "A public show. Every design credited. Every document ready. No closed boardroom. No edited interview. And if they come after us again?" "They will." Annie looked through the glass at Ruth sleeping inside. Then she reached for the silver thermos. "Good," she said. "This time, we'll be waiting." Within 48 hours, Julian's plan had become public. Rebirth. The truth in every thread would take place beneath the great clock at Grand Central Terminal 5 weeks later. The announcement named no luxury sponsor, no celebrity host, and no corporate partner. It listed only the designers, craftspeople, models, and legal representatives responsible for the event. The response from the fashion industry was immediate. 3 sponsors withdrew before noon. A hotel group canceled rooms reserved for visiting buyers. A lighting company doubled its price after claiming the show carried reputational risk. 2 well-known models backed out through their agents. The board of Ashford Maison issued a statement saying the company had no involvement in the event. Julian read it once and placed the paper face down. "They want the show to fail without appearing to stop it," Annie said. They were sitting in the old Garment District studio with Nathan and Celeste. Fabric samples covered the cutting table, while a floor plan of Grand Central had been pinned to the wall. "They are protecting themselves," Nathan replied. "That is the polite expression," Celeste said. "Cowardice also works." Julian studied the list of remaining expenses. "We proceed without them." Nathan removed his glasses. "You can finance the event personally, but every payment must be documented. Marcus will claim you used company funds. Then Ashford Mason will not pay $1. And Annie's work must remain legally separate from yours." "It already is." Nathan looked toward Annie. "I need you to understand what that means. Every design must be registered under the correct creator. If you and Julian work together, both names appear. If a design is yours, he has no ownership." "That was our agreement from the beginning," Annie said. "Agreements are useful. Signed records are better. Julian did not object. A month earlier, he might have taken offense at the implication that his word required documentation. Marcus had cured him of that weakness. Evelyn joined them that afternoon and examined Annie's sketches for the show. The collection she had begun after the hospital scandal was built around people who worked while the city slept. Cleaners, nurses, transit employees, caregivers, kitchen workers, and security guards. One coat used reflective tape along the seams, but only enough to appear when the wearer turned. A gray dress carried a pattern taken from the cracked tiles near the lower platforms. Another design included concealed pockets large enough for medication bottles, work gloves, and a folded train schedule. Evelyn stopped at a long dark blue garment with panels that opened like intersecting tracks. "This is the final piece?" Annie nodded. "I think so." "You think?" "The shoulder still feels too formal." Julian stood behind her but did not speak. Evelyn noticed. "You have an opinion." "I was not asked." Annie looked over. "I'm asking now." "The shoulder belongs to a different woman than the rest of the dress." Annie studied the drawing. "Because it is too controlled? Because it expects to be admired. The rest expects to survive." She erased the upper line and began again. Evelyn watched Julian step back without taking the pencil from her hand. "You have improved," she told him. "I assume you mean as a teacher." "I mean as a person who knows when to stop talking." Celeste laughed from across the room. The team grew through word of mouth rather than publicity. Older seamstresses who had worked with Julian during his early years offered their time. Former Ashford employees came quietly after work. Parsons students volunteered for fittings and production. A group of transit workers agreed to advise Annie on how uniforms moved during long shifts. Several of the models were women the industry had stopped calling. One was 62 and walked with a cane after knee surgery. Another was a mother of 4 who had left modeling 20 years earlier. A young man with a prosthetic leg asked whether the trousers could be adjusted without hiding it. "They should not hide anything you do not want hidden," Annie told him. He smiled. "That is not how fittings usually go." "It should be." Celeste took responsibility for the runway casting. She rejected anyone who treated the show as a chance to rescue Julian's reputation. "We are not staging a redemption commercial," she told one agent. "Your client is welcome to walk if she respects the work. She is not welcome to pose beside a scandal and call it courage." The legal preparations moved alongside the clothing. Nathan arranged secure copies of the bank transfers, server logs, original emails, and unedited recordings. Elliot Gray's mother agreed to provide a statement confirming that her son had never claimed ownership of Rebirth. A digital forensic specialist prepared a simple timeline that the public could understand. Nathan also contacted the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and federal investigators reviewing the wire transfers. "We are not announcing an arrest from the runway," he warned Julian. "Evidence goes to law enforcement before it goes to the audience." "I understand." "Do you?" Julian looked at him. "I want Marcus exposed. I no longer need to decide the form of his punishment." Nathan nodded once. "That may be the healthiest sentence you have spoken in 20 years. Security required equal care." Grand Central's management approved the event only after MTA police, fire officials, and station engineers reviewed the plans. Every backstage door was mapped. Emergency exits were tested. Access badges were numbered and photographed. Annie walked the service corridors with the station supervisor, Mr. Alvarez, who had known her since her first month on the cleaning crew. "You sure you want all these fashion people back here?" he asked. "No." "Good answer." He showed her an old baggage passage behind the temporary dressing area. "This corridor is not used much now, but it stays clear by code. If the main hall is blocked, this takes you east." Annie memorized the turns. At Hudson Presbyterian, Ruth followed the preparations from her bed. She had improved enough to sit upright for several hours, though her cardiologist refused to discuss discharge until her medication stabilized. Annie brought sketches to the hospital each evening. Ruth examined the final dress and opened her wooden sewing box, which Annie had carried from the apartment. Inside were old buttons, chalk, thimbles, and spools of thread saved from decades of work. Ruth selected a small brass button worn smooth at the center. "This came from the first winter coat I made for your mother." Annie held it carefully. "You kept it all these years?" "I keep things that still have a purpose." "Where should it go?" "That is your decision. I am not the designer." Julian stood near the window, holding 2 cups of hospital coffee. Ruth looked at him. You agree? It is her work. Good. You are learning faster now. Annie placed the button near the inside collar, where the wearer would feel it but the audience might never see it. The night before the first full rehearsal, Julian and Annie stood alone beneath the Grand Central clock. Temporary lighting rigs had been installed along the concourse, but the runway remained unfinished. Travelers passed around them, unaware that the space would soon hold the most important show of either of their lives. Are you afraid? Julian asked. Yes. Of failing, of being misunderstood again. Julian looked toward the departure board. We cannot control what everyone believes. I know. We can control the records, the names on the work, and whether we tell the truth. Annie nodded. That will have to be enough. Across town, Marcus Hale watched a news report about the show from his dark office. Behind the reporter appeared images of Annie working beside former Ashford seamstresses and transit employees. Gabriel Stone's voice came through the phone. Can you stop it? Marcus looked at the floor plan of Grand Central spread across his desk. Yes, he said, but this time, damaging Julian will not be enough. His finger settled on the backstage dressing area. We remove the girl, the clothes, and the reason anyone came to watch. By 6:30 the following evening, Grand Central no longer resembled a station preparing for rush hour. Temporary lights ran along the balconies, black curtains hid the backstage areas, and rows of guests filled the east side of the concourse. Reporters stood behind marked barriers while camera crews tested their sound. Annie was in the dressing area beneath the east balcony, checking the final sequence with Celeste. 23 models moved between garment racks, makeup tables, and folding screens. Several Parsons students helped with last-minute stitching. Julian stood near the entrance wearing a black suit without a tie. He checked his watch. 20 minutes, he said. Annie adjusted the brass button inside the collar of the final blue dress. You've said that 3 times. The time changes. Not that quickly. Celeste looked over the top of her glasses. Both of you are nervous. One of you is hiding it better. Julian opened his mouth. It is not you, Celeste said. A stage manager called for the first 6 models. Annie turned toward the garment rack, then stopped when the overhead lights went out. For half a second, the room was silent. Emergency lamps came on near the floor. What happened? Someone asked. A radio crackled and died in Celeste's hand. Annie moved toward the main door. Stay calm. The building has backup power. She pulled the handle. The door did not move. A production assistant tried beside her. It's locked. It can't be, Celeste said. That's a fire door. 2 people pushed against it together. Something metal scraped on the other side, but the door remained closed. Annie reached for her phone. There was no signal. Around them, the models began talking at once. One young woman pounded against the door and shouted for security. Another stared at the dark ceiling, breathing too fast. Then the sprinkler system activated. Cold water burst over the garment racks. Someone screamed, "Cover the clothes!" A seamstress shouted. People grabbed plastic sheets and garment bags, but several pieces were soaked before they could be protected. Ivory silk darkened under the water. Painted paper panels collapsed. Dye began running from one coat onto another. Annie stood still long enough to understand what was happening. This was not an electrical failure. Someone wanted the room sealed, the clothing damaged, and everyone inside frightened. Across the concourse, Julian watched the stage clock move past the scheduled start. The first music cue never came. Nathan approached him from the security station. We lost communication with the dressing area. Send someone back there. MTA officers are already moving. A member of Ashford Mason's former board stepped closer. You still have 12 completed looks in the West holding area. Start with those. The audience will tolerate a shortened show. Annie is in that room. So are most of the clothes, the man replied, which is why you need to save what remains. Julian looked at the guests waiting beneath the great clock. Several journalists were already reporting into cameras. On social media, a rumor had begun spreading that Annie had abandoned the show after refusing to let Julian use her work. The board member lowered his voice. Walk out there, explain that there has been a production delay, and begin with your own collection. Julian's face changed. My own collection? You cannot let one young designer take the entire event down with her. Julian stepped onto the runway. The room quieted as he approached the microphone. Behind him, the opening lights came on automatically. illuminating an empty path through the concourse. The music director waited for his signal. Julian looked toward the sealed backstage area. "This show will not begin," he said, "while the people who created it remain locked out of sight." A murmur moved through the audience. "We have been advised to continue with the garments still available. We will not." Rebirth was built by designers, seamstresses, models, transit workers, students, and people whose names were ignored for too long. None of them is replaceable because an audience is waiting. Nathan received a message from security and showed Julian the screen. Fire door obstructed from exterior. Forced entry in progress. Julian faced the audience again. "You may leave. You may criticize the delay, but there will be no show without the people whose hands made it possible." Inside the dressing room, water continued dripping from the ceiling after the sprinklers stopped. A young model named Kira sat against the wall, struggling to breathe. Annie crouched in front of her. "Look at me. I can't breathe." "You can. Follow me. In for 4. Annie counted with her fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Hold. Now let it out." Kira followed the rhythm until her breathing slowed. Celeste tested the door again. "Security is trying to reach us. They may take too long," Annie said. She looked around the room, then remembered the walkthrough with Mr. Alvarez. The old baggage passage. Annie crossed to the rear wall and pulled aside a clothing rack. Behind it stood a narrow service panel painted the same gray as the wall. "There's a corridor behind here." A seamstress examined the panel. "It's bolted. From this side." They found a wrench and a maintenance kit beneath the sink. 2 assistants loosened the bolts while Annie cleared the area. The panel opened onto a dark passage barely wide enough for one person at a time. Celeste looked inside. "Where does it go?" "East Service Hall. It should come out near the Lexington Passage." "Should? I've only seen the other end." Celeste nodded. "Good enough." Annie organized the group. Models first, then the students, then the seamstresses carrying whatever clothing could still be saved. Celeste stayed at the rear. They moved through the corridor under emergency lighting. Annie led them around 2 turns, down a short stairway, and through a storage area filled with old station signs. When they emerged near the East Passage, MTA officers were running toward them. Julian saw Annie across the concourse. For a moment, neither moved. Then he crossed the floor and stopped in front of her. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Ruth?" "Still at the hospital. She doesn't know yet." He looked toward the damaged garment bags behind her. Water dripped onto the stone floor. "How much did we lose?" "Most of the first section. Half of mine." The board member who had advised Julian to continue appeared nearby. "Then cancel. Issue a statement and preserve what evidence you can." Annie looked past him toward a group of transit workers in reflective jackets standing near the security barrier. She saw folded station maps on an information cart, unused cleaning cloths in sealed packages, luggage straps, spare work shirts, and the surviving fabric pieces carried from the dressing room. "No," she said. Julian turned to her. Annie removed her soaked jacket. Beneath it, she still wore the Navy maintenance uniform from her first night at Grand Central. "We have fabric." Celeste followed her gaze. "Not enough for the original designs." "Then we don't make the original designs." Annie gathered the seamstresses and students around a folding table. "We have 40 minutes. Use the dry panels from the damaged clothes. Cut away everything that bled. Bring me every clean work shirt, reflective strip, station map, and luggage strap you can find." A student stared at her. "You want to put cleaning uniforms on the runway?" "I want to put the people this collection is about on the runway." Julian watched Annie assign tasks, alter the sequence, and redraw the final silhouette on the back of a departure notice. She did not ask his permission. He did not offer it. For the next 40 minutes, the backstage passage became a workroom. Maps were folded into structured collars. Reflective strips became seams. Navy work shirts were cut, pinned, and joined with pieces of surviving silk. Ruth's brass button remained inside the final collar. When Annie stepped onto the runway wearing a reconstructed coat made from her old maintenance uniform, the audience rose before the music began. Julian stood in the shadows near the stage entrance. He had spent years teaching Annie how to make fabric obey an idea. That night, she taught him something harder. When the original vision is destroyed, an artist does not always rebuild what was lost. Sometimes she creates the truth from what remains. The first model stepped onto the runway wearing a charcoal coat whose torn panels had been joined by visible red stitches. The damage was not concealed. Each repair had been pulled to the surface and made part of the design. The audience, still standing after Annie's entrance, slowly returned to their seats. Music filled the concourse, low and restrained. Beneath the painted ceiling of Grand Central, Julian's original garments moved beside pieces reconstructed less than an hour earlier. Wet silk had been cut away and replaced with transit maps. Reflective strips crossed evening jackets. Navy work shirts became structured bodices. Luggage straps formed belts and shoulder lines. Nothing looked as Julian had planned. It was better for having survived. The first section of the show was called The Wound. Julian's designs appeared in black, ivory, and deep gray. Seams remained exposed. Fabric separated at the shoulders and came together again near the heart. One white gown carried a dark stain across its skirt, not unlike the damage caused by the sprinklers backstage. Julian stood near the stage entrance, watching garments he had created before Marcus betrayed him. For months, he had viewed them only as evidence of what had been stolen. On the runway, they belonged to him again, not because no one else had copied them, but because each piece carried the history of the hands that had made it. The second section began without a pause. The unseen belonged to Annie. An older woman walked with a cane through the center of the concourse wearing a dark green dress with a hidden opening along one side. The construction allowed her to sit, stand, and move without pulling the fabric around her ribs. A hospital worker modeled a soft gray coat with deep interior pockets for gloves, identification cards, and medicine. A man with a prosthetic leg wore trousers cut to reveal the metal rather than disguise it. Then came the reconstructed garments. A former cleaner from Grand Central walked in a coat made from Navy maintenance shirts. The names of station workers had been stitched inside the collar. A young model wore a skirt formed from folded transit maps, each route preserved beneath a clear protective layer. Reflective seams flashed only when she moved. The audience could not see the frantic work that had created those pieces, but they could see the difference between clothing designed about working people and clothing created with them. In her hospital room, Ruth watched the live stream on a tablet propped against a water pitcher. A nurse had agreed to stay for the final section, though she had warned Ruth not to become too excited. "That is my granddaughter," Ruth said as Annie appeared briefly at the edge of the runway. "I know," the nurse replied. "You have told me 4 times. I may tell you again." Back at Grand Central, the lights dimmed. Celeste Monroe stepped onto the runway. She wore Annie's final design, "There is Still Light." The dress was deep blue, with panels that opened like intersecting railway lines. The shoulder Julian had once called too formal had been removed and rebuilt with a strip from Annie's old uniform. Ruth's brass button rested inside the collar, invisible to the audience but close to Celeste's skin. As she walked, silver threads caught the light and disappeared again. The garment did not demand attention from one direction. It changed depending on where the viewer stood. Celeste stopped beneath the clock. For several seconds, the station remained silent. Then applause rose through the concourse and up toward the balconies. It was not the controlled response of a fashion audience waiting to be seen appreciating something important. Transit workers, students, seamstresses, and invited guests stood together. Some of the loudest applause came from people who had never attended a runway show before. Julian stepped onto the runway after the final model returned. Annie waited near the entrance, expecting him to take the traditional walk alone. Instead, he held out his hand. She joined him. Julian then motioned toward the backstage area. The seamstresses came first, followed by the students, models, station employees, dressers, technicians, and volunteers. Each name appeared on the large display above the departure board. No one was listed as an assistant to an unnamed genius. Every contribution had an owner. When the applause faded, Nathan walked to the microphone with Celeste and a gray-haired woman Annie recognized from old photographs as Elliot Gray's mother. "My son did not create Rebirth," Mrs. Gray said. Her voice trembled, but she continued. "Elliot admired Mr. Ashford's work. He also wanted a career of his own. The people responsible for this lie used my son's death because they believed a dead man could not correct them." Behind her, the screen displayed a timeline prepared by digital investigators. Original sketches from Julian's archive appeared with verified dates from 6 years earlier. Next came the server records showing Marcus Hale accessing those files after midnight. Bank transfers connected his private consulting company to an intermediary working for Stone International. The forged emails appeared beside Elliot's original messages. Altered dates and moved sentences were highlighted in red. Then the unedited studio video played. The audience saw Annie asking Julian to criticize her work honestly. They saw the full conversation that had been cut into an accusation. The false contract appeared next, followed by the Parsons form from which Annie's signature had been copied. Nathan did not dramatize the evidence. He allowed the sequence to speak. Near the west exit, Marcus turned away from the screen. 2 MTA police officers stepped into his path. He changed direction, but another officer approached from behind. Beside them stood one of the men hired to secure the dressing room door. His hands were cuffed, and he would not look at Marcus. "You paid him through the same company used to move the stone money," Nathan said from the stage. "Investigators obtained the payment record this afternoon." The crowd turned. Marcus looked across the concourse at Julian. "You think this makes you innocent?" he called. "Without me, you are an aging man trying to dress up his past." Julian did not raise his voice. "Without you, I finally have the chance to become the man I should have been." The officers led Marcus away as cameras recorded every step. Julian moved back from the microphone and offered it to Annie. She looked over the audience, then toward the workers standing behind her. "Some people called me a victim," she said. "Others called me a liar. Almost no one asked what I knew." Her voice steadied. "Mr. Ashford did not create my talent, and he does not own it. He made mistakes. He thought money could solve problems that required listening, but he also learned to stand behind me instead of speaking in my place." She looked toward the screen displaying her name beside her designs. "When people decided I was invisible, they also decided they had the right to tell my story for me. They were wrong." Annie placed the microphone back on its stand. "Do not call someone unseen and then claim the right to speak with their voice." The applause returned, but Julian barely heard it. He looked around at the damaged clothes, the transit workers, the women who had sewn beside him before he became famous, and the young artist who had rebuilt an entire show from what others considered worthless. His name might recover after that night. It might not. For the first time, that question no longer decided whether his life still had meaning. 3 weeks after the show, Marcus Hale was charged with theft of trade secrets, wire fraud, document forgery, unlawful confinement, and conspiracy to obstruct an investigation. Gabriel Stone resigned from Stone International after federal investigators traced payments from one of his companies to Marcus's private account. The company's board denied knowing how the collection had been obtained, but emails recovered from Stone's office showed that he had asked Marcus whether Julian could be removed from the market before Paris. Elliot Gray's mother gave one interview and refused all others. "My son wanted his own work to be remembered," she said. "He would never have wanted his death used to destroy another artist." The fabricated emails were withdrawn by the major outlets that had published them. Corrections appeared beneath the original headlines, though Julian noticed they were smaller and received less attention. Nathan warned him not to expect the public apology to equal the public accusation. "A lie arrives dressed for a parade," Nathan said. "The correction usually comes through the service entrance." Julian accepted that. He had spent most of his life believing reputation could be managed through perfect timing, controlled language, and the right photograph. Marcus had understood that weakness because Julian had helped build the machinery around it. At the first meeting after he returned to Ashford Maison, Julian stood before the board and refused their offer to restore him without conditions. "I did not steal the collection," he said. "That does not mean I did nothing wrong." Several directors shifted in their seats. He had allowed one man to control security footage, press access, internal messaging, and the reputations of younger employees. He had rewarded silence because it made the company efficient. He had mistaken obedience for loyalty and fear for respect. The new policies were not presented as charity. Interns would be paid. Every contributor would be named in the permanent design records. Young artists would receive independent legal advice before signing contracts. Complaints against senior executives would go to an outside review office rather than through company management. Julian also surrendered final authority over internal investigations. One director objected, "You founded this company. That is not a reason to make it dependent on my judgment." He remained creative director but stepped down as chief executive. For the first time, Ashford Maison would continue without requiring Julian to control every room. Ruth returned home in early spring. The doctors adjusted her medication and ordered her to reduce stress, advice she treated as a personal insult. "I am 72, she told Annie. "Stress has had my address for years." Julian brought chicken soup on her first evening back. It came from a restaurant and arrived in porcelain containers. Ruth tasted one spoonful. Too much salt. I can have something else delivered. That is exactly the lesson you keep failing. She pointed toward the chair beside her. Sit down. Julian sat. Ruth placed the bowl in his hands. The soup is already here. We will eat it, complain about it, and do better next time. He smiled. That sounds less efficient. Most human things are. Annie returned to Parsons and completed the preparatory program. Her blind review design remained in the student gallery, now displayed beside the full process book so no one could question its authorship. At the end of the term, Evelyn called Annie into her office. You received the full scholarship, she said. Annie did not answer. Evelyn looked over her glasses. This is usually where the student reacts. I'm making sure I heard you correctly. Tuition, materials, and a living stipend. The committee's decision was unanimous. Annie pressed both hands against her knees. Did Julian speak to them? No. He asked whether he should, and I told him I would remove him from the building if he tried. That sounds like him. No. Listening sounds new for him. Julian offered Annie a position at Ashford Mason after her first year. She declined before he finished explaining it. I need to know my name can stand alone, she said. It already can. I need to know that without yours standing beside it. Julian was quiet for a moment. Then I will wait until you ask. The Annie Carter Fellowship for Unseen Artists opened that summer. Annie objected to the name until Ruth reminded her that discomfort was not always a reason to refuse responsibility. The fellowship paid tuition, supplied materials, funded legal support, and guaranteed that every student retained ownership of their work. The first stage of selection was blind. No photographs, addresses, family histories, or stories of hardship were shown to the judging panel. Julian rejected a proposal to film the recipients in their homes. They are artists, he said. Their poverty is not advertising material. 1 year after the night of the show, Annie held her first small exhibition inside Grand Central Terminal. Ruth sat near the entrance in a burgundy coat of Annie's design, with hidden fasteners and enough room through the ribs for her to breathe comfortably. Celeste stood beside her, correcting anyone who referred to the show as Julian's project. Evelyn spoke with students near the west wall. Transit employees came before or after their shifts, some still wearing their uniforms. At the center of the exhibition hung The Man Who Lit the Darkness. Beside it was a new painting. It showed a young woman in a maintenance uniform, offering a silver thermos to a man seated beneath the station clock. Neither face was fully visible. The light came from the narrow space between their hands. Julian stood before it for several minutes. Annie approached carrying the same thermos. The dent near the bottom had been polished but not removed. What are you worried about? She asked. Julian looked around the terminal. Ruth was laughing at something Celeste had said. Young artists from the fellowship were studying Annie's sketches. A station worker had stopped beside one of the paintings and was explaining to his daughter that her mother worked the same night shift. Nothing tonight, Julian said. You're still here. Annie shook her head and pointed toward the people gathered around them. Not just me. We're all here now. Julian looked at the clock above the concourse. A year earlier, he had sat beneath it believing his life had ended because the world no longer admired him. Now his name appeared nowhere on Annie's exhibition wall. He had never been prouder of anything. His eyes filled, and this time he did not lower his face or turn away. An artist, he finally understood, did not live forever because his name was sewn inside a dress. He lived in the doors he opened, the hands he refused to control, and the light someone else carried forward after he stepped aside. This story reminds us that true greatness is not measured by wealth, fame, or power, but by how we treat people who have been overlooked. Annie's kindness saved Julian when the world had turned against him, while Julian's guidance helped her believe in her own voice. Their journey shows that compassion must never become control. Mentorship should create independence, and justice requires the courage to stand beside the truth even when lies are louder. Sometimes, one sincere act of kindness can restore a broken life and open doors for many others. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.